Welcome. In this episode, we will begin our discussion of ancient Rome. Last time, we concluded by finishing up the Greeks and spoke about how the ancient Greeks were, after the conquests of Alexander the Great, were eventually conquered in turn by armies of the Republic of Rome. Here we had the dates of Rome roughly of its, not of its total existence, but of its key strength. Remember, our focus is on modern world history, the title of the course, and so all of our study of ancient and medieval history is necessarily quick, and so this quick overview of some of the highlights of the ancient world. First, one of those key takeaways that helps explain how and why the world is the way it is our study of the government of Rome. Rome, very famously, prior to Julius Caesar, was a republic. It had a Senate, which is where we get the term Senate, of a representative body that was still in use in the world today. And it was a republic, had a republican form of government, which means it had a representative democracy or an indirect form of democracy, where these senators were sort of elected. They tended to come from same families in a certain class, but they were basically elected to have power in the lawmaking and leadership of Rome. The Republic, which was a very beloved institution in Rome, and the Senate was brought down by Julius Caesar. Caesar was a successful general, and he led his troops to conquer Gaul, which was France. And he very famously brought his army onto the Italian peninsula and broke a rule, which was no general should lead their armies south of the Rubicon River because armies were very dangerous. Their pay wasn't very good, their benefits weren't very good. One of the chief ways that generals rewarded their armies was with loot and pillage, and they would permit their soldiers to rape, loot, and pillage people that they conquered. And so Caesar was very popular with his men because he gave them those victories and loot and pillage all throughout Gaul. And so Caesar, as the commander, was supposed to be loyal to Rome, but his own men are loyal to him. And so by leading an army south of the Rubicon toward the city of Rome, this was, having broken a rule, seen as a threat to the country, or the Republic of Rome. Well, for a short time, people sort of permitted this, and Julius Caesar came to power. There was actually a triumvirate where he and some others ruled, but he ultimately consolidated all the power in his hands and was working to become like an emperor or dictator. But as he was on his way to the Forum, which was the name of the place where the senators would meet, he was famously warned. The legend goes that he was warned by like a passerby, like a witch, a soothsayer on the side of the path, who had told him to, quote, beware the Ides of March, which was a particular date, the 15th of March. And he kind of thought that was weird, but then, as fate would have it, as the legend says, he was then stabbed to death by many of the other senators. This here's Caesar as he's slain in the Senate as they pull knives out from their togas and assassinate Julius Caesar. There are those who want to restore the Republic. There are those who want revenge for having killed Caesar. There are those who are glad they killed Caesar. There are those who thought it was a good idea, then regretted it. It's all very dramatic. William Shakespeare has a very famous dramatic play about Julius Caesar, and puts words into the mouths of several of the key figures. But the two things that come out of it: one, a famous boss nerd phrase is that he allegedly, as he died, said something along the lines of et tu Brutus, et tu Brute. One of his best friends was named Brutus and was among those who pulled out a dagger and murdered Caesar. And so this is a common phrase that we still see in acts of betrayal. Like if someone betrays you, you might say to them, et tu Brutus, and they would say, yeah, you're kind of a nerd for saying things like that. That's why I'm betraying you. Well, that would be really too bad for them. But a common phrase indicating betrayal. Lastly, as the republic then falls, Caesar is succeeded by his own nephew, Octavian, who takes the name Augustus, the august one, the heralded one, the one who is, in a way, you interpret Augustus like the golden boy. He's the one. And the empire expands nearly to its height of its power in the early years AD. This is at the time of the birth of Christianity and the birth of Christ in the Holy Land, and these are contemporaneous events to that, for those keeping track. And it forms the Roman Empire. And in fact, so much so that he's Augustus Caesar, but the name sticks, and the name Caesar continues as all future emperors take that as their name, and it lives even beyond the Roman Empire, as the Second Reich in Germany takes the term Kaiser, which is derivative of Caesar. In Russia, they take the term Tsar. Their kings for centuries were called the Tsar, which, even though it doesn't sound much like it, if you look at how the word is spelled, you see the root connection to the word Caesar. And so Julius Caesar and his nephew Augustus Caesar really leave a legacy of the Roman Empire that lasts for centuries, even unto the present day. What other aspects of legacy we take from the Romans? One, the legend of the glory of Rome. There is this sense of the good old days. Rome, even before it fell, there was a sense of, we used to have a republic, then it fell. And then, strongmen took over the government and ran it not as a democracy any longer, as a republic any longer. Secondly, when Rome truly falls to the barbarians, there is also this kind of legend of the good old days, of the glory of Rome. So Rome always very much has kind of a backwards looking, nostalgic aspect to it throughout history, that, even if it wasn't that great in many ways, there is always kind of a sense of longing for a bygone era that is associated with the study of ancient Rome. And finally, the fragility of democracy. This idea that the republic, the democracy, can be lost. Don't grow complacent. Don't think that nothing could ever shake or disrupt a democracy. All it takes is for unscrupulous men to seize power. All it takes is for it can be one event that can bring down a democracy. And so whenever people make this claim or this argument that a democracy or a republican form of government can be very fragile and very easily fall to a more totalitarian or authoritarian form of government, a classic, more modern example they point to is the Nazi regime in Germany, but the classic example is that of ancient Rome. A few other classic things that we take that explains how and why the world is the way it is the legions of ancient Rome. The legion, as compared in this photo, the legions actually fought comparatively well against the Greek phalanx. They did not fight in this giant formation like the phalanx did, but in more nimble, smaller units. They tended to use the gladius, or the Roman short sword, to great effect once they closed in on these types of units. And so the Roman legions is a nickname for their armies that were very, very successful at conquering the known world. Romans also picked up on that sort of definition that the Greeks had used of the barbarians, that outside the confines of that Roman Empire were the barbarians, the Germans, the Huns, the people outside of this area, and were constantly pushed back, and the borders of the Roman Empire, the civilized known world, became roughly the Mediterranean Sea, which is rather unique to the world. We must remember that in the ancient world, waterways were like our modern highways. They were not barriers. We today think of water as a barrier that has to be crossed by bridges and airplanes. But at this time, floating things on sailboats or even rowboats was by far the easiest way to travel. And so water, rather than in our modern way of thinking being a barrier, was a highway of navigation, a place for trade, ideas, and people to flow very easily, and therefore it makes a lot of sense. See, what were barriers, right? Dense forests of the north of Europe, the deserts of Arabia and the Sahara in Africa, the mountains of the Caucasus. Those were barriers that blocked human empires and trade and war. Water actually facilitated that. And so that is a major reason why the Roman Empire took the shape that it did. And a little bit similar to Alexander's empire, which was more of a Greek and Eastern empire, though. All right, and they conquered the entire known world, and it led to something called the Pax Romana, Latin for the Roman peace. And it doesn't. They fought wars constantly, but the wars were never in their homeland, or very rarely. For hundreds of years, war was something that happened out here against barbarians on the frontier. We have to remember the ancient world was a very dangerous and violent place, and so this Roman peace, the strength of the armies of Rome, led to centuries of relative peace and ease and flourishing of trade, ideas, and people throughout this area. An analogy we can use is some have called the period since World War II, even though there's been a Cold War and even though there have been more minor conflicts that have resulted in quite a bit of loss of life, but there have not been other world wars, some call that a Pax Americana or a Pax Atomica, that America's ascendancy to world power leads to kind of a world peace when it comes to world wars. And the irony of a Pax Atomica is that the atomic or nuclear weapons have meant that mankind has avoided a world war. Now, the scary thought is that just like Pax Romana came to an end, there are those who would say, well, isn't this modern kind of avoidance of a huge world war, isn't that maybe going to come to an end? Hopefully not. But we can, again, draw that analogy to the ancient Romans. And the last thing we'll talk about, next time we'll talk about law and language. We'll talk just briefly about the Roman class system. In ancient Rome, you had the patricians and the plebeians, was a very common distinction among the Roman people. The patricians, the root comes from the Latin pater, the patri part. Pater is a father, a fatherly figure that has authority and can discipline and chastise. These are the nobles. These are the elites of Roman society called the patricians. We also get the word pater familias, the head of the family. These are the patricians, the nobles, the lords. Everyone else are the plebeians, the plebs, the everybody else, the not so hot. Some of these folks are full legal Roman citizens. Some are non-citizens. They're conquered peoples, and some are slaves. However, this is ancient slavery and not to be confused with our modern, so-called modern, race-based slavery. Slavery in this era is based on war and sometimes debt, not race. Slavery in the Roman Empire was more frequently temporary, something that one did not have one's entire life, and it was rarely permanent and almost never generational. Slavery could not be passed on to one's children. It didn't automatically mean one was a citizen, but the status of being a slave, it was closer to being, in the Roman days, is closer to being a peasant or a degraded servant, not the type of race-based generational slavery that in most ways was much worse. That would come many centuries later, but the word is somewhat similar, or the same. We still derive from this a legacy, and we'll see this take place in the Middle Ages in about 2 future videos, where you have this strong class distinction, and it is very difficult to go from one class to another. It was actually not as difficult to pass from being a non-citizen to a slave or vice versa, but to join the ranks of the patricians, of the truly upper class, was almost impossible. Again, one could make some success, and there are limited opportunities in the business world. The main way would be to somehow have military success and become a landowner out in the far reaches of the empire, and then one day sort of rise up through the ranks of becoming a patrician. And that is a class distinction we will see throughout this course. Thanks for watching.